is autumn haze, and I never believed in fate. Not until I felt its invisible threads tugging at my life, pulling me toward a past I thought I'd left behind. They say time heals all wounds. They're wrong. Some wounds just scab over, waiting for the slightest touch to break them open again. Mine reopened the moment I saw him standing in the bookstore, 5 years after he walked away. Blake Carter, the boy who taught me how to love, the man who taught me how loving someone isn't always enough. I should have turned around, walked out the door, and never looked back. That would have been the smart thing to do. But nothing about loving Blake had ever been smart. Chapter 1. Present day. The bell above the door chimes as I push into Crossroads Books, seeking refuge from the autumn rain that suddenly drenched Seattle. The familiar scent of old pages and coffee wraps around me like a blanket, comforting and warm against the chill that clings to my damp clothes. Just in time, says Marion, the silver-haired owner who's been running this place since before I was born. Another minute and you'd have needed a boat instead of an umbrella. I smile, shaking droplets from my auburn hair. I think I left my umbrella in the same place I left my common sense at home. My voice sounds normal, casual even, though my heart hammers against my ribs with such force I'm surprised Marion can't see it through my rain-soaked sweater. Because 3 aisles over, partially hidden by the towering shelves of poetry, stands the silhouette I'd recognize anywhere, even after 5 years, even after promising myself I'd forget. Blake. His dark hair is shorter now, and he's traded his college hoodies for a charcoal sweater that stretches across broader shoulders. But the way he stands, weight shifted to 1 foot, head tilted slightly as he reads, that hasn't changed at all. I should leave. I should thank whatever cosmic force warned me and run back into the rain before he sees me, before 5 years of carefully constructed distance collapses into nothing. The new white man novel came in, Marion says, oblivious to my internal panic. I put it aside for you behind the counter. Thanks, I manage, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. I'll just browse a bit first. I duck into the nearest aisle, fiction, alphabetical by author, and press my back against the shelves. The spines of books dig into my shoulder blades, a physical discomfort that grounds me as I try to steady my breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 years since I last saw him. 5 years since I stood in the rain, much like today, and watched him drive away. 5 years of rebuilding a life that didn't revolve around Blake Carter. And now here he is, casually browsing poetry, as if he hasn't been a ghost haunting every relationship I've attempted since him, as if he doesn't still appear in my dreams, making promises his waking self couldn't keep. Autumn. His voice hits me like an electric shock, and suddenly I'm 22 again, standing in our apartment as he tells me he can't do this anymore, that he needs space, that maybe we rushed into forever. I force myself to turn, to face the collision I've been avoiding for 5 years. Blake stands at the end of the aisle, a book of poetry dangling forgotten from his fingertips. His eyes, those deep blue eyes, that once looked at me like I was the answer to every question, widen with recognition and something else, something that makes the scabbed over wound in my chest throb with renewed pain. It is you, he says, his voice lower than I remember. I thought I was seeing things. I swallow hard, suddenly aware of how I must look, hair dampened by rain, no makeup, wearing the Northwestern University sweatshirt that once belonged to him. Of all the days to run into Blake Carter, it had to be when I look like I've barely survived a storm. Maybe that's fitting. Blake, I say, and his name feels both foreign and achingly familiar on my tongue. I didn't know you were back in Seattle. He takes a step closer, and I resist the urge to step back. Moved back last month, he says. The firm opened a branch here, and he pauses, runs a hand through his hair. Another gesture so familiar it hurts. I missed the rain. I almost laugh at the absurdity. Blake, who complained about Seattle's endless drizzle every winter we were together. Blake, who dragged me to California on spring break just to feel the sun. Blake, who left for Chicago's equally dismal weather when he left me. You hated the rain, I say before I can stop myself. A small smile tugs at the corner of his mouth, revealing the dimple I once traced with my fingertip in quiet moments. Maybe I was wrong about a lot of things. The weight of his words hangs between us, heavy with implication. 5 years ago, I would have clung to that hope, would have read volumes into those 7 words. But I've learned the hard way that hope is a dangerous thing when it comes to Blake Carter. Well, I say, shifting the conversation to safer ground. Welcome back. I should get going. The rain's letting up. It's alive. Through the bookstore's front windows, I can see the downpour has only intensified, turning the street into a river of headlights and umbrella tops. But I need to escape before I do something stupid like forgive him, or worse, remember why I loved him. Autumn, wait. Blake steps closer, close enough that I can smell the faint trace of his cologne still the same, after all these years. Can we get coffee, just to catch up? There's so much I've wanted to. I can't, I interrupt, the words coming out sharper than intended. I have plans. Another lie, but an end to one. I'm only plans. Involve a bottle of wine, take out Thai food, and the manuscript I need to edit by Monday. Disappointment flashes across his face, quickly masked by understanding. Of course, I should have realized you'd be busy. It's just... He hesitates, then reaches into his pocket and pulls out a business card. If you ever want to talk, no pressure. I take the card reflexively, our fingers brushing in a moment of contact that sends a jolt through my system. Blake Carter, Senior Editor, Meridian Publishing, a Seattle phone number, an email address. You're at Meridian now? The question slips out before I can contain my surprise. Meridian is one of the biggest publishing houses on the West Coast, the same publishing house that rejected my manuscript last year. Blake nods, a hint of pride crossing his features. Made the move from legal publishing. Turns out contract law wasn't feeding my soul. He smiles, and for a moment, I see echoes of the boy who used to read poetry aloud to me on lazy Sunday mornings. What about you? Still writing? The question stings more than it should. Blake always believed in my writing, even when I didn't. He was the one who pushed me to submit my first short story, who celebrated with champagne when it was published in a literary journal no one had heard of. He was also the one who left before I finished my first novel. Freelance editing pays the bills, I say with a shrug that I hope appears casual. Writing is more of a hobby these days. This is my 3rd lie in as many minutes, and I wonder when I became someone who lies so easily. Writing isn't a hobby, it's an obsession, a necessity, the thing that kept me sane when Blake left. The novel I finished in the aftermath of our breakup sits in my desk drawer, rejected by 12 publishing houses, including his. Autumn. Marion calls from the counter, saving me from further conversation. Phone call for you, dear. It's Eliza. Relief washes over me. Eliza, my roommate and best friend, doesn't even know I'm here. Marion is offering me an escape route, her knowing eyes telling me she recognizes Blake, remembers the weeks I spent hiding among her bookshelves after he left. I have to take that, I say, already backing away. It was unexpected seeing you, Blake. Autumn, he says, my name sounding like both a question and a plea on his lips. Just coffee, please. There are things I need to say to you. 5 years ago, I would have given anything to hear those words. 5 years ago, I waited by the phone for months, hoping he'd call with an explanation, an apology, anything. But that was 5 years ago. Goodbye, Blake, I say, turning away before he can see the emotions I know are written across my face. As I walk toward Marion and her fictional phone call, I feel his eyes on me, following my retreat. And despite everything, despite 5 years of carefully teaching myself not to care, I find myself slipping his business card into my pocket instead of the trash can I pass. Some threads, it seems, are harder to cut than others. 5 years ago, the first time I met Blake Carter, I hated him, which in retrospect should have been a warning sign. Hewitt requires passion, and passion has always been my downfall. It was my junior year at Northwestern, and I was working the closing shift at the Inkwell, the campus coffee shop where literary-minded students gathered to discuss Proust and pretend they weren't procrastinating on their term papers. The bell above the door jangled at 10:55 p.m., 5 minutes before closing, and in walked Blake, rain-soaked and irritatingly handsome. "We're closing," I said without looking up from the espresso machine I was cleaning. "I know," he replied, his voice carrying a confidence that made me look up. "But I promised my study group I'd bring coffee, and they'll murder me if I show up empty-handed. 5 Americanos, please." The please was an afterthought, tacked on like punctuation rather than genuine politeness. I narrowed my eyes, taking in his expensive watch and perfectly disheveled hair. Another rich kid who thought the world operated on his schedule. "The espresso machine is already clean," I said, gesturing to the gleaming metal I'd just spent 15 minutes scrubbing. "You close in 4 minutes. There's a 24-hour diner 3 blocks down that serves coffee." Something flashed in his blue eyes, frustration, challenge, or maybe both. "I'll make it worth your while," he said, pulling out his wallet. "Double whatever you're charging, plus a $20 tip." I should have said no, should have stood my ground on principle. But I was a scholarship student working 3 jobs to make ends meet, and $20 meant groceries for the week. "Fine," I muttered, turning back to the espresso machine. "But I'm charging you triple." He grinned, and something inside me shifted uncomfortably. "Deal." As I made his order, he leaned against the counter, watching me with interest. "You're in Professor Whitman's advanced fiction workshop, aren't you?" he asked suddenly. I nearly dropped the cup I was holding. Professor Whitman's workshop was the most exclusive class in the creative writing department, limited to 12 students per semester. I'd fought tooth and nail to get in, submitting a portfolio that had taken months to perfect. It was my pride and joy, the one place I felt truly seen. "How do you know that?" I asked suspiciously. "I'm in it too," he said, that infuriating grin still playing on his lips. "Your autumn haze. You wrote that story about the girl who could see how people would die. Best thing I've read all semester." My cheeks warmed with unexpected pleasure, quickly doused by suspicion. "If you're in Whitman's class, how come I've never seen you there?" "I audit on Thursdays when my law classes don't conflict," he explained. "Double major, English Lit and pre-law, Blake Carter." He extended his hand across the counter. I ignored it, focusing on sealing the to-go cups. "That's $47.50, I said, keeping my voice professionally detached. He handed me 3 $20 bills. "Keep the change, and maybe I'll see you in class sometime." As he gathered the cup carrier and headed for the door, I called after him, unable to help myself. Why would a law student want to audit a fiction workshop? Blake paused, one hand on the door, and looked back at me with an expression that was suddenly serious, vulnerable even. Because sometimes I need to remember there's more to life than case precedents and tort law, he said quietly. Sometimes I need to remember why words matter. With that, he pushed through the door and disappeared into the rain, leaving me standing behind the counter, holding $60 and the unsettling feeling that I had completely misjudged Blake Carter. 2 days later, he showed up in Whitman's workshop with coffee, an Americano, exactly how I took it, and placed it on my desk without a word. The cup had my name written on it, along with a small drawing of a crow, the central symbol from my story. When I looked up to thank him, he was already across the room, deep in conversation with Professor Whitman. But later, when I read my story aloud to the class, I caught his eyes on me, intense and focused, as if he was trying to see past my words to the person behind them. It was the first thread connecting us, invisible but undeniable. I just didn't know then how tightly it would eventually bind us or how painfully it would pull when stretched to breaking. Present day. He said, I don't call Blake for 3 days. His business card burns a hole in my pocket, then my wallet, then the drawer of my bedside table where I finally banish it, tucked between old birthday cards and the ticket stub from the last concert we attended together. Out of sight, but never truly out of mind. You're being ridiculous, Eliza says on Wednesday night, as she watches me aggressively chop vegetables for stir-fry. Just call him. What's the worst that could happen? He'd point my knife at her, a piece of red pepper dangling from the tip. The worst that could happen is that I remember why I loved him, fall for him again, and then have to piece myself back together when he inevitably decides that Seattle and me aren't what he wants after all. Eliza rolls her eyes, stealing a slice of pepper from my cutting board. For, she says, crunching thoughtfully, the best that could happen is you get closure, or hot XX, or God forbid, an actual explanation for why he left 5 years ago. I don't need an explanation, I insist, attacking an innocent onion with renewed vigor. He wasn't ready for commitment. I wanted forever. He wanted freedom. Tale as old as time. But even as I say the words, I know they're a simplification. What happened between Blake and me was more complicated, more painful than I've ever admitted, even to Eliza, even to myself. The truth is, Blake didn't just leave. He disappeared 2 weeks after I miscarried the baby. Neither of us had planned the baby that, despite its unexpected arrival in our lives, had somehow become a future I could see clearly. Blake holding a dark-haired child, teaching them to read, to write, to see the beauty in words the way we both did. The loss gutted me, us, and the aftermath. As I drowned in grief, Blake became increasingly distant, working late, sleeping on the couch, until finally he sat me down and told me he'd accepted a job in Chicago. I can't do this, Autumn, he said, his eyes focused somewhere over my shoulder. I'm not ready for this life, for the weight of it. I never was. I didn't fight, didn't beg him to stay. I was too empty, too hollowed out by grief, to do anything but nod and watch him pack. And in the years since, I've never told anyone the full story. It was easier to let people believe we simply grew apart, that Blake left for a better job, a bigger city. Easier than admitting that, when I lost our baby, I somehow lost him too. The sizzle of the walk brings me back to the present, to Eliza watching me with concern in her eyes. Earth to Autumn, she says gently. Where did you go just now? I shake my head, forcing a smile. Just thinking about deadlines. The Morrison manuscript is kicking my ass. Eliza doesn't believe me. She knows me too well for that. But she lets it drop, shifting the conversation to her latest dating disaster. As she regales me with tales of the mansplaining botanist she met on Hinge, my phone buzzes with a text from an unknown number. I nearly drop it when I read the message. I'm at the inkwell. Feels like old times, except you're not behind the counter calling me an entitled jerk. If you wanted to accidentally run into me again, I'll be here for another hour. Blake. The inkwell, not the campus coffee shop where we met, but its namesake here in Seattle, a literary cafe where local authors give readings and aspiring writers huddle over laptops. My cafe, the one place in the city that has been my sanctuary since moving back after graduation. What is it? Eliza asks, noticing my frozen expression. I wordlessly hand her the phone, watching her eyes widen as she The universe is practically shoving you two together, she says, handing it back. That's fate, babe. That's not fate, I counter, turning back to the stir-fry that's now in danger of burning. That's him invading my space. He knows I go there. How would he know that? Eliza asks reasonably. You said yourself you haven't spoken in 5 years. She's right, damn her. The odds of Blake choosing my favorite cafe randomly are slim, but the alternative that he's been asking about me, learning my habits, is equally unsettling. I'm not going, I declare, aggressively stirring vegetables. Eliza sighs dramatically, reaching past me to turn off the burner. Yes, you are, she says, taking the wooden spoon from my hand. Because if you don't, you'll wonder what he wanted to say for another 5 years, and I refuse to listen to you overanalyze this text message for the next month. I hate that you know me so well, I grumble, but I'm already reaching for my jacket. Change your shirt at least, Eliza calls as I head for the door. You've got onion all over you. 20 minutes, and one wardrobe change later, I push open the door to the inkwell, my heart hammering painfully against my ribs. The cafe is busy for a Wednesday night, a local poet reading from her latest collection in the corner, while the after-work crowd nurses artisanal coffees. I scan the room, telling myself I'll leave if I don't spot him immediately. But there he is, at a table by the window, 2 cups of coffee in front of him, his attention focused on the well-worn book in his hands. I recognize it instantly. Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, the same copy I gave him for his 23rd birthday, its margins filled with my annotations. The sight of it nearly stops me in my tracks. He kept it, all these years, through moving across the country and back. Blake kept the book I gave him. I don't know why this affects me so deeply, but it does. Before I can second-guess myself, I approach his table. Is this seat taken? I ask, my voice steadier than I feel. Blake looks up, surprise and pleasure washing over his features. It's reserved, he says, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For a talented writer who once told me I was the most entitled customer she'd dead served. Despite myself, I laugh, sliding into the chair across from him. I stand by that assessment, I say, gesturing to the 2 coffee cups. Though I see you've graduated to ordering for people without their consent. Blake pushes one of the cups toward me, an Americano, I note with a twist in my chest. I took a gamble, he says. If your coffee order has changed, I'll get you something else. I wrap my hands around the cup, drawing comfort from its warmth. Still an Americano, I admit. Some habits are hard to break. The words hang between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Blake's eyes meet mine, and for a moment, I see a flash of the pain I've carried for 5 years reflected back at me. It's disorienting. This evidence that perhaps he hasn't moved on as completely as I imagine. Autumn, he begins, his voice low and serious. I owe you an apology. Many apologies, actually. But I'll start with I'm sorry for texting you out of the blue. I saw your photo on the local author's wall. He gestures to the collection of framed pictures near the register, where my awkward smile has been immortalized since my short story collection was published last year. I asked the barista if you still came in, and she said you're here almost every morning. Schrader, I murmur, making a mental note to have words with Zoe, the purple-haired barista who has apparently been giving out my habits to ex-boyfriends. Don't blame her, Blake says with a soft laugh. I may have implied we were old friends trying to reconnect. Is that what we're doing? I ask, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Reconnecting? Blake sets down the book, his expression turning serious. I don't know, he says honestly. I just know that seeing you in that bookstore felt like. He pauses, searching for words, which is so unlike the Blake I knew, the Blake who always had the perfect quote, the perfect phrase. It felt like something I didn't deserve but desperately wanted anyway. The raw vulnerability in his voice catches me off guard. This isn't the smooth-talking law student I met in college, nor the distant boyfriend who walked away when things got hard. This is someone new, or perhaps someone who was always there, beneath layers I never fully uncovered. Blake, I say carefully, it's been 5 years. People change. Lives change. What exactly are you hoping for here? He looks down at his coffee, then back up at me, his blue eyes more serious than I've ever seen them. Honestly, a chance to explain. A chance to apologize properly for how I left, and maybe, if I'm incredibly lucky, a chance to know who you are now. Part of me wants to walk away, to protect the life and heart I've so carefully reconstructed. But another part, the part that still wakes from dreams of him, with an ache in my chest, wants to hear what he has to say, needs to hear it, perhaps, to finally move on. I'm listening, I say finally, settling back in my chair. Blake takes a deep breath, as if preparing lift a heavy weight. What happened to us, to you, the baby? He stops, swallows hard. I've never forgiven myself for leaving when I did, when you were in pain, when we both were. His voice catches, and I'm startled to see the shine of tears in his eyes. I told myself I was protecting you by leaving, that I was too broken to be what you needed. But the truth is, I was a coward. I couldn't face the grief, couldn't face the fact that I had started to want that future as much as you did, and then it was gone. His honesty hits me like a physical blow, and I grip my coffee cup tighter to steady myself. All these years, I'd convinced myself that Blake had never really wanted our baby, that he'd seen the miscarriage as a convenient escape from a commitment he wasn't ready for. The possibility that he had grieved too, that he had wanted our child, had never occurred to me. Or perhaps I hadn't let it, because it was easier to be angry than to acknowledge the full depth of what we had lost. You never said, I whisper, my voice barely audible over the cafe's ambient noise. You never told me you wanted it too. Blake's expression crumples. Because I was terrified, he admits. Terrified of how much I wanted it once I knew. Terrified of failing at the most important thing I could ever do. My own father left when I was 8, and I was so afraid I'd do the same to our child. And then when you lost the baby, he trails off, collecting himself. It felt like confirmation of my worst fear, that I wasn't meant for that life, that happiness. So I did exactly what I feared I would do. I let the poet in the corner finishes her reading, and applause briefly fills the cafe. giving me a moment to absorb his words. The Blake sitting across from me now is laying himself bare in a way the Blake I knew 5 years ago never could. It would be easier if he were still that person, the one I could righteously hate for abandoning me. This Blake, with his painful honesty and evident regret, is harder to dismiss. I needed you, I say finally, my voice steadier than I feel. I lost our baby, and then I lost you too. Do you have any idea what that was like? No, he says simply, not attempting to defend himself. I can imagine, but I know that's not the same. I know I hurt you in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time. His eyes meet mine, unflinching despite the pain reflected there. I don't expect forgiveness, Autumn. I don't deserve it, but I've spent 5 years trying to become someone who might have stayed, someone who could have been brave enough to face that pain with you instead of running from it. The raw honesty in his voice makes something shift in me, loosening a knot I've carried for so long. I'd forgotten it was there. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding, and maybe that's all either of us can hope for tonight. Why now, I ask, the question that's been burning in me since I saw him in the bookstore. Why come back to Seattle? Why find me after all this time? Blake runs a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture that still makes my heart twist. The simple answer is the job at Meridian, he says, but the truth. He hesitates, as if weighing how much to reveal. The truth is I saw your book, The Invisible Seasons. I was in this bookstore in Chicago, and there it was on the staff picks shelf. My breath catches. My collection of short stories, published by a small press last year. Stories about loss and grief, and finding your way back to yourself. Stories inspired, in large part, by what happened between us, though I've never admitted that to anyone. I read it in one sitting, Blake continues, his voice false with something like reverence. And I heard your voice in every word, saw you in every character. The story about the woman who plants a garden, where her child would have played. He stops, emotion making his voice rough. I knew it was about us, about what happened, and I realized that while I'd been trying to outrun my grief, you'd been brave enough to transform yours into something beautiful. I swallow hard, fighting back. Unexpected tears. No one has ever connected that particular story to my personal experience. Not my editor, not my friends, not even Eliza. But Blake saw it immediately, read the truth beneath the fiction, just as he always could. When the opportunity at Meridian came up, he continues, it felt like the universe was offering me a chance to, I don't know, make amends somehow. I don't want to undo what I did. I know that's impossible. But to at least tell you how sorry I am and how proud I am of what you've created from your pain. His words touch something tender and vulnerable inside me, something I've protected fiercely since he left. The knowledge that my writing mattered to him, that he recognized the truth in it, means more than I want to admit. I don't know what to say, I admit, my voice barely above a whisper. I never expected to have this conversation. She'd convinced myself you'd forgotten all about me, about us, about... I can't bring myself to say it, even now. She'd been... I never forgot, Blake says firmly. Not for a single day. I tried, believe me. She edited her people, threw myself into work, moved across the country, but you were always there, Autumn. In every book I read, every word I edited, every story that moved me, smiles sadly, invisible threads. The phrase catches me off guard, sending me back to a winter afternoon in our tiny college apartment, snow falling outside as we lay tangled together, discussing a poem I'd been assigned. "The invisible threads are the strongest ties," I'd said, quoting Friedrich Nietzsche. "What do you think that means?" Blake had been quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin. "I think it means that what we can't see can still bind us," he'd finally answered, "that the connections that matter most are the ones that exist even when everything else falls away." Now, 5 years and a lifetime of pain later, he remembers not just the phrase, but the moment, the meaning we found in it together. And I'm suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of everything we were to each other, everything we lost, and the possibility, however small, that some threads cannot be broken, only stretched. "I should go," I say abruptly, gathering my bag. This is a lot to process." Blake nods, disappointment flashing across his face before he carefully masks it. "Of course," he says. "Thank you for coming at all. I know you didn't have to." He reaches into his pocket and pulls us something small, pushing it across the table toward me. A flash drive, sleek and black. "What's this?" I ask, not touching it. "Your manuscript," he says quietly. "The one you submitted to Meridian last year, the thread that binds. I found it in the rejection pile when I was going through the archives. I read it, and," he shakes his head, as if still in disbelief. "It's beautiful, Autumn. It deserves to be published. I've made some notes, not as your ex, but as an editor who believes in your voice." I stare at the flash drive, my heart pounding. That manuscript, my first novel, the one I poured my soul into after Blake left, the one that collected nothing but form rejections, is my most vulnerable work. The thought of Blake reading it, seeing all the raw emotion I channeled into those pages, is terrifying. "Why would you do that?" I ask, my voice sharper than intended. "Because it's good," he says simply. "Because it deserves to be read. Because regardless of our personal history, I still believe in your talent." He pushes back his chair, standing. "The notes are just suggestions. Take them or leave them. But if you want to resubmit to Meridian, I've flagged it for Mark Holloway, our executive editor. No strings, no mention of our connection, just your work, which stands on its own." He's giving me space, I realize. The Blake I knew 5 years ago would have pushed, would have used this moment to try to win me back. This Blake seems content to simply open a door and let me decide whether to walk through it. "I don't know if I can trust this," I say honestly. "Trust you." Blake nods, accepting the blow. "I understand," he says quietly. "Just know that whatever you decide about us, whether you never want to see me again." He trails off, leaving the alternative unspoken. "The offer to help with your book is separate. No conditions. You're too talented to let old wounds get in the way of your future." With that, he turns to go, leaving me with a cool Americano and a flash drive that suddenly feels impossibly heavy. At the door, he pauses, looking back with an expression I can't quite read. "I'm at the inkwell most mornings," he says, "if you want to talk more about the manuscript or anything else." Then he's gone, the bell above the door chiming softly in his wake, and I'm left wondering if the universe is offering me a second chance or setting me up for another heartbreak. Either way, I can't deny the invisible thread still pulling between us, as strong and undeniable as it was the day we met. 4 years ago, I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday. Oh, a rainy Seattle Tuesday, 3 months after graduation, when Blake and I were still figuring out how to be adults, how to pay bills and cook meals that didn't come from a box, how to be together without the convenient framework of college surrounding us. I sat on the bathroom floor of our tiny apartment, staring at the plastic stick with its unmistakable double line, and felt my carefully planned future shift beneath my feet. I had a job lined up at a literary magazine that barely paid enough for ramen. Blake was studying for the bar exam, working nights at a law library to make ends meet. We weren't ready. We had never discussed children. We were still children ourselves in so many ways. When I told him, standing in our kitchen with dinner burning forgotten on the stove, I expected panic, watched for it, braced for it. What I didn't expect was the complex series of emotions that crossed his face. Shock, yes, but also something that looked strangely like wonder. A baby, he said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. Our baby. For a brief, shining moment, I allowed myself to hope, to see a future I hadn't planned but might want anyway. Blake holding a dark-haired child, teaching them to read from the classics he loved. The three of us, a family, different than my careful 5-year plan, but perhaps better in all the ways that mattered. That night, he held me closer than usual, his hand drifting to rest on my still flat stomach. Neither of us spoke about what would come next, but in the shelter of darkness, I felt his tears against my shoulder. I didn't know then if they were tears of fear or joy or something in between. I never got the chance to ask. 3 weeks later, the cramping started. By morning, I was in the hospital, the words spontaneous miscarriage echoing in a room that felt too bright, too sterile for the grief already taking root inside me. It's common, the doctor said kindly, especially with first pregnancies. There's nothing you did wrong. But as Blake drove us home in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, I couldn't help but wonder if the universe had simply recognized what we hadn't been brave enough to admit, that we weren't ready, weren't meant to be parents. Not yet, maybe not ever. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of grief neither of us knew how to navigate. I took time off work, spent days in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I could mourn something I'd barely had time to want. Blake threw himself into studying, staying at the library until midnight, coming home after I was asleep. We existed around each other, two planets in increasingly distant orbits, connected but never quite touching, until the morning I woke to find him packing, methodically folding his clothes into a suitcase we'd bought for a trip to Mexico we never took. "I can't do this," he said when he noticed me watching. "I thought I could, but I can't." "Can't do what?" I asked, my voice hoarse from sleep and unshed tears. "Be with me?" He wouldn't look at me, focusing instead on the careful alignment of shirt sleeves. "Be this person," he said quietly, "this version of me that you need. I'm not strong enough, Autumn. I'm not enough." "That's not true," I said, something desperate clawing its way up my throat. "We can get through this. Together." "People do it all the time." Blake finally looked at me then, his blue eyes filled with a sadness so profound it stole my breath. "Maybe some people can," he said, "but I don't know how. All I know is that I look at you and see everything I couldn't protect, everything I failed." "You didn't fail," I insisted, reaching for him. "It just happened. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't mine. We can try again, someday, when we're ready." But even as I said the words, I could see they weren't reaching him. He had already gone somewhere I couldn't follow, retreated behind walls I had no idea how to scale. "I got a job offer," he said eventually, "in Chicago, a good firm, good money. I'll send for my other things once I'm settled." And just like that, it was over. 5 years of love, of building a life together word by word, moment by moment, undone in a single conversation on a gray Seattle morning. I didn't cry as he finished packing, didn't beg him to stay. Some stubborn, broken part of me refused to give him that. I refused to be the hysterical girlfriend clinging to someone who had already decided to leave. Instead, I made coffee while he loaded his car, handed him a cup in a travel mug, his favorite, the one with a Shakespeare quote about journeys, and kissed him one last time, memorizing the feel of him, the scent, the familiar curve of his lips against mine. I hope you find what you're looking for, I said, stepping back. I hope Chicago makes you happy. It was the greatest lie I ever told. What I really wanted to say was, don't go, stay with me. We can fix this. We can try again. I love you enough for both of us until you remember how to love yourself. But I said none of that. Just watched from the window as his car disappeared around the corner, taking with it the future I'd begun to imagine, and the man I thought would be by my side through everything life threw at us. That afternoon, I started writing what would eventually become the thread that binds, pouring all my grief and rage and love onto the page, creating a world where broken people found their way back to each other, where loss transformed rather than destroyed, a world I no longer believed existed in reality, but could still create in fiction. Until now, standing in the inkwell with Blake's flash drive burning a hole in my palm, wondering if some stories don't end where you think they do. If some threads, stretched to breaking point, can still pull you back to where you began. Present day. I don't sleep that night. Shoo. I don't sleep that night. How could I? With Blake's words echoing in my head, with the flash drive sitting on my nightstand like a time bomb waiting to detonate. They toss and turn until the sheets are a battlefield, until finally, at 3 a.m., I give up and pad to my tiny home office. The cool blue glow of my computer screen illuminates the room as I insert the flash drive, my finger hovering over the trackpad. Do I really want to see what Blake thinks of my most personal work? Do I want to reopen the wounds that inspired it? But even as I ask myself these questions, I'm clicking open the folder, scanning the content. There's my manuscript, untouched, and beside it, a document simply titled Note. With a deep breath, I open it, bracing for criticism, for Blake to have missed the point entirely, for any reason to dismiss his opinion and protect myself from caring what he thinks. What I find instead unravels me. Autumn, if you're reading this, thank you for trusting me enough to consider my thoughts. I want to start by saying your novel is extraordinary. The raw honesty, the complex characters, the way you weave hope through even the darkest moments. It's all there, and it works beautifully. You've always been the more talented one between us, and this manuscript proves it beyond doubt. My suggestions are minimal and entirely focused on structure. The middle section, where Ellie returns to her hometown, feels slightly rushed compared to the careful pacing of the rest. I've highlighted a few places where expanding these scenes might give readers the same emotional impact as the beginning and end. There's also a recurring motif with the river that Teves in chapters 1, 8, and 22. It's powerful, and I wonder if threading it through a few more key moments might strengthen the symbolic resonance. Just a thought. The ending is perfect. Don't change a word. It's earned, authentic, and stays with you long after the final page. If you decide to resubmit to Meridian, I've already spoken with Mark about its strength. He's excited to read it, but whatever you decide, know that this book deserves to be in the world. Not because I want to make amends, though I do. Not because I still care about you, though that hasn't changed, but because you've written a story that will help people feel less alone in their darkest moments. That's a gift only the best writers can give, and you are, without question, among the best I've ever read. Blake, by the time I finish reading, tears are streaming down my face, because his notes are thoughtful, professional, spot on, because he saw exactly what I was trying to accomplish with my novel, because somehow, despite everything, he still believes in my words, my voice, my stories, and because part of me, a larger part than I want to admit, still cares that he does. I spend the rest of the night rereading my manuscript with Blake's suggestions in mind, seeing my work through his eyes. By the time dawn breaks, painting my apartment in soft gold light, I've made decisions about the manuscript, about Meridian, and maybe, just maybe, about Blake. I shower and dress carefully, taking time with my appearance in a way I haven't bothered with in months. Eliza raises an eyebrow as I emerge from my room in a deep green sweater that brings out my eyes, hair falling in soft waves around my shoulders. Hot date with the barista, she asks, spooning cereal into her mouth. I'm going to the inkwell, I say, not answering her question. I have some writing to do. Her eyes widen with understanding. You're going to see him, she says, a statement rather than a question. Blake, I'm going to work on my book, I insist, but the flush creeping up my neck betrays me. If he happens to be there, you'll accidentally look amazing in that sweater he always loved. Eliza finishes with a knowing smile. Just be careful, Ott. Guard that heart of yours. It's been through enough. I know what I'm doing, I say, though I'm not entirely sure that's true. What I do know is that for the first time in 5 years, I'm willing to find out, to see if the thread that once bound Blake and me so tightly can be rewoven into something new, something stronger for having been broken and mended. The morning air is crisp as I walk the 6 blocks to the inkwell, autumn leaves crunching beneath my boots. The flash drive sits in my pocket, a small weight against my hip. My heartbeat quickens as I approach the cafe, scanning the front window for a glimpse of dark hair, broad shoulders. He's there, at the same table by the window, laptop open, coffee steaming beside him, working, not waiting. I realize with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. This isn't a romantic comedy where he's been sitting there since dawn, hoping I'll appear. This is real life, where he has a job and responsibilities, and has simply incorporated this cafe into his morning routine, leaving the possibility of seeing me to chance, or fate, or invisible threads. I push through the door. The familiar bell, announcing my arrival. Blake looks up, surprise and pleasure washing over his features when he sees me. He doesn't immediately wave me over or stand to greet me, giving me space to decide whether I want to acknowledge him at all. Another change from the Blake I knew, who would have assumed his welcome. He'd order my Americano from Zoe, who smirks knowingly between us but says nothing. Then, coffee in hand, I approach his table. Is this seat taken? I ask, viewing our exchange from yesterday. Blake's smile broadens, genuine and warm. It is now, he says, closing his laptop to give me his full attention. The simple gesture, choosing me over work, shouldn't affect me as much as it does, but it's another small indication of how he might have changed, of priorities shifted. I sit, placing the flash drive on the table between us. I read your notes, I say without preamble. They're good. Helpful. I'm going to make the revisions. Relief crosses his face. I'm glad, he says. The book deserves the best chance it can get. I'm also going to resubmit to Meridian, I continue, watching him carefully. But I need to be clear about something. I lean forward, meeting his gaze directly. If they accept it, it has to be because the manuscript deserves it. Not because you pulled strings. Not because of our history. I won't be a charity case, or a way for you to assuage your guilt. Blake doesn't flinch from my directness. Absolutely, he agreed. I've already told Mark I have a personal connection to the author and removed myself from the decision-making process. He'll evaluate it purely on merit. He hesitates, then adds quietly, "But Autumn, it's good enough. It always was. I think it just landed on the wrong desk the first time around. I want to believe him. Want to believe my work stands on its own, that I'm not just fooling myself with dreams of being a real author. And the fact that Blake, who always had the more practical view of the publishing industry between us, believes in it so strongly helps more than I care to admit. Thank you, I say simply, for the notes, for the opportunity, kid. It means a lot." "You're welcome," he replies, equally simple. Then, carefully, he adds, "But I hope you know that's not why I wanted to see you again. The manuscript is separate. What I said yesterday about wanting a chance to explain, to apologize properly, that stands regardless of what happens with the book." I take a sip of my coffee, using the moment to collect my thoughts. There's so much between us, so much history, pain, and yes, love too. Love that there quite died, just went dormant, waiting. I've been thinking about what you said. I begin carefully, about grief and fear and running away. And I understand it better now, I think. Not that it hurt any less, but I get it. I pause, gathering courage for what comes next. What I don't know is where we go from here. 5 years is a long time. Blake, we're different people now. Anyway, he agrees, his expression serious. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we needed to become these people, stronger, more honest versions of ourselves, before we could find our way back. He reaches across the table, not quite touching my hand, but close enough that I can feel the warmth of his skin. I'm not asking for everything back, Autumn. I know that's impossible. I'm just asking for a chance to know who you are now, and to show you who I've become. The sincerity in his voice touches something deep inside me, a place I've kept carefully guarded since he left. And for the first time, I allow myself to consider the possibility that this meeting, after all these years, might not be an ending to our story, but a new beginning, different from what before, shaped by our scars, rather than defined by them. I think, I say slowly, choosing my words with care, that I'd like that, to get to know each other again, slowly. Blake's face lights up with a cautious hope that makes my heart flutter. Slowly, he agrees. We have time now. No need to rush. I nod, feeling something shift and settle inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but its possibilities. The beginning of a path forward rather than the constant looking back that has defined my last 5-5. How about we start with breakfast, he suggests. The inkwell makes amazing avocado toast. I can't help but laugh. You hate avocado, I remind him. You once called it green mush for people who don't value taste. Blake grins, that familiar dimple appearing. Like I said, people change. His eyes hold mine, warm and hopeful, some things for the better. And as the morning light streams through the window, painting golden highlights in his dark hair, I feel the invisible thread between us grow stronger, no longer pulling painfully but simply connecting, reminding us of what once was and what might be again, different, perhaps. Stronger, maybe, for having been tested, but real. As real as the words on the pages of my manuscript, as enduring as the stories we tell to make sense of our broken heart. Avocado toast sounds perfect, I say, and mean it. Sometimes the stories we think are over are just waiting for a new chapter. And sometimes the threads that bind us, invisible but unbreakable, lead us right back to where we need to be. Not to the people we were, but to the people we've become, stronger, wiser, ready, at last, to love without fear. And just like Autumn and Blake connected by invisible threads, I feel connected to you, who've taken the time to listen to this story until the end. Have you ever felt the invisible threads connecting you to someone from your past? Or perhaps you're struggling to forgive and start a new chapter. Share your experience in the comments below. I read every single comment that comes in. If Autumn and Blake's story touched your heart, show it by hitting the like button. Every like gives me the energy to keep creating stories that touch souls. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, tales of love, loss, and the invisible threads that connect us all, hit the subscribe button now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Because just as Autumn finally opened her heart to new possibilities, I also want to continue opening new worlds for you through meaningful stories. See you in the next story. Remember, sometimes the strongest threads are the ones we cannot see.